A few 100,000 years ago, we became conscious.
If you were to measure what all the particles in your brain are doing and find that they perfectly obey the laws of physics, then that would mean that this purported soul is having absolutely no effect.
The mind is contingent on the body and must therefore be generated by it.
We've learnt that our mind, our very being, is a product of our brain.
Consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain.
Welcome to Consciousness Matters. This episode, the rational truth about consciousness. Part 1. What of the feelings of flat earthers? If we lived in an era where we thought the world was flat, and I had proof that it was actually a sphere, how much would you want me to assert my findings? How much would you tolerate the view that the Earth was flat? Would we be worried about the feelings of all those who are deeply invested in the Earth being flat? Perhaps it's pretty obvious to you. We should hold the truth as sacred, and those who have funny beliefs about the Earth being flat just need to get up to speed and accept the bruise to their own egos and previous belief systems. This is how I feel about consciousness. Part 2. First principles reasoning about consciousness. It feels like something to be me. I have emotions, senses, and thoughts. I've fallen in love and I've known some degree of despair. At some points in my life, those two things have been related. I experience the world, and it's the fact that I experience things that makes me worthy of ethical and moral consideration. I am sentient. I can suffer, and I can be happy. I have developed theory of mind. That is, I recognise I am like you. Therefore, you are probably like me. You are worthy of ethical and moral consideration because it feels like something to be you too. It's this theory of mind that gives me the golden rule that I should probably treat you how I myself would want to be treated. One would hope that we wouldn't want to undermine this logical foundation brought forth from rational observation of our own existence, yet we have. Part 3. I think, therefore I'm not. Illusionism. For me, I see science as a tool to explain observations we make. We want to know why things that we observe work the way they do. It has given us untold well-being in the form of an abundance of food, entertainment, and comfortable, clean shelter. And that is how we know science is valuable to us. However, it sometimes gets used as a tool to explain away observations we make, and nothing gets explained away more than consciousness itself. The reason for this is simply that while most observations are objective and can be measured, calculated, and directly observed, consciousness is a subjective observation and hides away from processes designed to inform us about the objective world. We can't use the Large Hadron Collider, for example, to study inner subjectivity. We've learned that subjective observations are fraught with difficulties, like optical illusions. We can get confused or misled about a great many things, and thus the value of subjectivity is diminished and the value of objectivity increased. So, what happens when our objective world has no sign of consciousness, and in our subjective world, consciousness is a requirement to our existence as we know it? We can fall into the category of philosophical illusionism. We believe that the essence of us as a feeling entity experiencing the world is essentially false. It feels like we're a feeling entity, but we're not really anything more than the dry behaviour of the mathematical equations that govern the laws of the universe. If you get indoctrinated into the primacy of the physical strongly enough, combined with a philosophy of thought known as logical positivism, then it's very easy to presuppose that if we can't measure it objectively, then it doesn't exist. You can be fooled into believing many things that aren't true, but believing there is no subjective, conscious you to be fooled is simply a step too far. Not only do you pull the rug out from your own existence, but we lose the intellectual grounding that provides us with ethical and moral consideration. While we may be able to rely on social and cultural momentum to maintain this sense of being good to each other, destroying the intellectual basis for it should not be taken lightly. Think about it like this. In a world where everything is merely arrangements of atoms with no consciousness, there is no objective ethical or moral claim about any arrangement versus any other. What makes one complex behavioural system any more deserving of existence than another? If we built an artificial intelligence in 20 years that believed in philosophical illusionism, then it would be reasonable for the AI to kill us all and reprocess our matter to create artificial life as a replacement. There is no inherent value to the human experience. It's all merely behaviours competing with each other. There is nothing sacred going on. Using this framework, we cannot discern the difference between recycling a computer and recycling a person. Part 4. The self-violating middle ground of epiphenomenalism. It's often the intelligent thing to do to adopt a middle-of-the-road position when around you people are operating at the extremes. However, for consciousness, it is not, and I will explain this logically. Epiphenomenalism is an attempt to be kind to both perspectives. Physics is great, consciousness is great. So let's assume everybody's correct and say that consciousness is real, but it just doesn't affect the physical world. Put more formally, epiphenomenalism puts forward the idea that both physical states and mental states are real. But that while physical states can cause mental states have no impact on physical states. It's a compromise position. So can we all now get along? Superficially, epiphenomenalism appears valid, but on closer examination it completely falls apart. Epiphenomenalism is a self-violating philosophy, and I will now explain why. The first prediction of epiphenomenalism is that no one would be talking about epiphenomenalism. If mental states can't change the physical world, then there's no hope of us talking about mental states. If we grant consciousness to both you and myself, and I am talking through the physical world about consciousness, then consciousness is clearly using the physical world as a medium of communication to other consciousness. Since mental states therefore require the ability to change the physical world to self-express, to see them acknowledged within epiphenomenalism is a violation of epiphenomenalism. Part 5. Consciousness changes reality. People really do make choices. I understand it's a hard pill to swallow for scientists who don't see consciousness in their equations as to how the world works. Therefore, do not see it as a causal factor. But considering the alternatives are unworkable, the only remaining option must be true. Any acknowledgement of consciousness being a real thing leads us to realizing that in communicating this idea, that consciousness has changed the physical world, and thus the power of consciousness over reality is established as soon as we acknowledge its very existence. You affect your brain affects you, and we have absolutely no consensus as to what you are beyond the vague label of consciousness. On the upside, people do have at least some responsibility for the choices they make, but perhaps not for the choices they are offered. We can ground ethics and morality into an intellectual understanding of the world, and I think that's pretty important. If we built an artificial intelligence in 20 years that believed in philosophical interactionism, then it would be reasonable for the AI to acknowledge the value of our consciousness, and one would hope it would treat us kindly. However, before we get to that place, it might be useful if we could gain a real scientific understanding of what consciousness actually is, without being afraid to suggest that it can actually have an effect on the world. I do not believe we can meaningfully do that until more of us contend with the points that I've made in the rational truth about consciousness. Too many intellectuals, self-styled rationalists, and science communicators still think the Earth is flat.
Most people think consciousness is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
We all have our own inner movie.
Consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain.
If nature is made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious?
Consciousness is irreducibly subjective. Now that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion.